The next subject is how woke are our universities and what can we do to stop platforming. And we have Charlie Bentley-Astor to my right here, recent University of Cambridge graduate and a free speech advocate, and Professor Eric Kaufmann, who bills as the Professor of Politics at Birkbeck College, but he's just moved to the University of Buckingham. So I think I'll start with you, Charlie. I mean, you're a recent graduate. How woke was Cambridge University?
Obviously, it depends what we mean by woke. I have to disagree with Matthew in the assertion that it's not a conspiracy. It's not necessarily a conspiracy on the part of the academics, but certainly on the part of the students. So from my own experience, I tried to host a screening of a film on population decline called Birth Gap, Childless World. I invited the filmmaker to come and speak at the screening of his film. And within 12 hours of me advertising the fact that this film existed, a group of students decided that they were going to rally together to protest against it. They were trans rights activists. What's that got to do with population decline, I hear you say? Who knows? We tried asking, they never gave us an answer. But in an attempt to take us down, they wrote to the faculties that advertised the fact that this existed. Now, these faculties didn't say to these students, oh, you really must go and see this film, it's very important. They merely put it on a list of things you could do that week. And so these activists wrote to these faculties and accused them of promoting genocide and didn't substantiate that with any kind of evidence. These students hadn't watched this film because this film wasn't available to watch. And what's more is that these students knew that this was a lie when they were confecting the outrage that they were going to levy against us. And I know that this was confected because I sat in their group chats under a pseudonym watching them plot against us. And I have the text messages which I've yet to be able to publish, but certainly the Academics for Academic Freedom have logged this, and I do think it's a conspiracy on the part of some students. Some students are terrified and are certainly being led around by those who aren't terrified but see the potential for power in these interactions.
Very good. And very, very inventive of you as well to do that. Eric, I mean, you're moving to what I think would be described as the soundest university, or have moved to the soundest university in the country at Buckingham. But what's been your experiences at Birkbeck?
Well, thanks very much, Andrew. Yeah, well, of course, many of you will have come across the coverage at Birkbeck. You know, I had an open letter, I had several Twitter mobbings, I had internal investigations over a period from 2018 to 2022, mainly due to things I was writing in the media or social media. Wasn't enough to drive me out the way Kathleen Stock was driven out. This is largely driven by radical activists, staff, and students. I just decided after 20 years to give up a full-time tenured professorship and move to the University of Buckingham, which is the only institution in this country out of 181 that is expressly putting academic freedom above social justice in its hierarchy of values. It's not that it's against social justice, but just it's placing those traditional academic values of freedom of expression and the pursuit of truth as the highest values. And so I've set up there, I've got a new online course available to the public on woke. It's a 15-week lecture. It's the kind of thing that would not be taught in a normal university, but I'm determined to do this at Buckingham, so please do check that out. The question is raised, how woke are our universities? And I mean, Matt was kind enough to mention a few things. I've done quite a bit of survey research on this question. And the thing we have to recognize is this is not your traditional state-led threat to individual liberties. This is coming from institutions that lie between the state and the individual. That private censorship is the main threat, I would argue, to our freedoms today. The universities would be a perfect example of that. And this is driven in a process I would call emergent authoritarianism, activists pressuring institutions to censor. That is one process, the sort of vertical punishment process which I experienced. But more insidious, or as insidious, is the sort of horizontal political discrimination process. In other words, if someone finds out you're a conservative or a Brexiteer, you will not get a job, you will not get promoted, you may not get hired, you may not get a grant. So these are all, or get your paper published. That is a sort of peer-to-peer discrimination, and it arises because we have a very unbalanced academia. Matt said 10 to 1. My survey shows around 9 to 1 left to right in the social science disciplines. 1 in 3 British academics wouldn't hire a known Brexiteer for a job, right? So we're in that kind of an atmosphere of vertical punishment, horizontal political discrimination, punishment and discrimination leading to self-censorship, of which surveys show something between 1/2 and 3/4 of conservative academics in the US and Britain are self-censoring. And so you also get graduate students who pick up on this. They realize academia is a place for left-wing people and they don't enter. So you get this spiral, right, of discrimination, punishment, leading to self-censorship, and that then leads people who are unconventional, who aren't going to conform to the orthodoxy, who aren't going to enter the system, and it gets purer and purer and purer, and that's how we've got into this spiral. And of course, the literature on Cass Sunstein and others who've written on conformity, the more an institution becomes homogenous, the more that empowers extremism. People lose track of what normal is, and they push each other towards the extremes. And that's what we have got now in our universities. What do we do to deal with that? I think that the higher education bill is important in clamping down on cancel culture, but we have to find a way of bringing more viewpoint diversity into the academy. As I mentioned, Buckingham is the only institution that has even some of that within the UK system. In the US, some of the Republican states are mandating the creation of centers that have an alternative non-leftist viewpoint. I think something like this is eventually going to be necessary, I'm afraid. This idea that universities can reform, impossible. So it's going to have to come from government, sorry. But as I said it before, the threat is at these middle-layer institutions. The government can actually protect freedom by clamping down on the ability of these institutions to censor. And so you have to understand there is a role for government. It is the key actor. It is elected. These universities, this is all behind closed doors, unelected. You need to have government to clamp down on these institutions in order to empower the individual students. Thank you.
Thank you. Eric, sorry. Thank you. I think Jacob made some very good points earlier when he was speaking at the University of Bristol, and they're going to charge 600 quid for security, which basically meant there was a form of no platforming going on there because these student societies cannot possibly afford the £600. There's also things like, even if they do provide the security, even if they do pay for this, if you've got a baying mob of people who want to run into a lecture theatre and basically cause as much trouble as possible, which will mean that it's going to be cancelled, that's still a form of cancel culture. And I think this is where the problems are. Now, we have a very good student society, Freedom Society, at the University of Exeter. It has been going now for certainly over 10 years, probably close to 15 years. I'm looking at my predecessor in the audience up there thinking, can he even tell me? But I think it's a good 13, 14, maybe 15 years. And they don't have problems down there like that in Exeter. And they wouldn't allow those problems. So I think it's also a bit of a student fight back. I think that starts to open up the next question, which is what can we do to stop no platforming? And I think that's one of my suggestions. You get good, strong, libertarian freedom societies there who are going to make sure that they fight back on campus. What do you think?
I think that's very important. Ultimately we have to win the battle of ideas. Politics and laws won't save us if the ideas, the free speech culture crumbles. So I'm totally on board with that, but I think actually, realistically today, the other side has the power. And under the new Academic Freedom Bill, actually universities have a duty not just to protect, but to promote academic freedom. So if they are charging these fees to student groups, if they are permitting hecklers in, if they aren't punishing students, then they can be They can be sued. They should be seen as being in breach and in violation and fined, which Arif Ahmed, who is the Academic Freedom Director, has the power to do. He needs to exercise that power. He needs to be very clear and set the tone very early. I think that can put a stop to this, honestly.
Yeah, I mean, Arif was invited to this conference, but unfortunately his diary was too full, because I would love to have had him here on the stage and speaking to us, and I'm sure he'll do an event for us in the future, because I really want to hear from him. What would you have to say, Charlie?
Certainly following up on everything that Eric has said. With my event at the University of Cambridge, I wrote to the proctors, who are essentially the free speech guardian angels of the university, and they said to me, until the event is cancelled, we can't do anything. And so I fought along on my own for a couple of weeks, and then the event was cancelled. So the first thing I did was write to them and say, okay, the event has been cancelled, now what will you do? And they went, oh, it's not really our jurisdiction. So of course I went to the rule book and threw it at them. And even after that, there are sort of, the rule book at Cambridge is sort of this thick, but there's 10 commandments, and students who caused the event to be shut down were breaking 3 vital ones, which is you cannot stop other students from congregating, you cannot stop other students from speaking, and you cannot stop their guests from speaking. And so they weren't hazy about, whether who's done this, who's done that. It was very clearly, I wanted to stage an event, it got shut down because students were protesting it, and therefore my rights as a student were being violated, those of the other students who wanted to see this talk were being violated, and so was the rights of my speaker. And essentially they shrugged their shoulders. So it is endemic. I don't know the extent to which the incentives that have been put in the new higher education free speech bill are going to help, because ultimately the universities have to want to do something. Now, obviously, we've tried the nice incentives, well, if you could please possibly uphold, the rules that you have and already committed to, that would be nice, but they're not. And so it is sort of with taking the stick to it with the financial penalisation. But what can we do about it? There is a poverty of bravery.
Good expression.
Yeah.
What a good expression.
Go on, no, go ahead.
I would say that under the legislation, there's an ombudsman that you can sort of make your case to on the Academic Freedom Directorate. And, these things should be in the press, and Arif would then have the ammunition to really go after and embarrass these universities.
So I worked with Arif at the university. I didn't end up intentionally doing this. I just sort of fell into it because my convictions. But essentially, I saw that the issues with cancellation are, as Jacob said, it's not students turning up and then the university necessarily going, oh no, we don't. Kowtowing to their screaming, though sometimes obviously that does happen. It's more that they create many problems for security and safety, in that they have these very private group chats where they prepare to have a protest and rumour goes round that there's a protest, and the student newspaper will advertise the fact that there's a protest. But there'll be no idea of numbers, the style of protest, whether they plan to be inside, outside, whether they plan to attack the speaker, interrupt the talk. And so my role in the pushback was, as with my own event, hung out in these group chats and went back to the hosts to inform them what was going on so that they could hire appropriate security. And so people like Helen Joyce, Jordan Peterson, Kathleen Stock were able to go ahead, but it took me squirreling around with all these students baying for my blood to make sure these things happen. And I can do that because I'm not afraid. But even in the classroom, I challenge teachers, and they sort of scoff and laugh off because they kind of can't believe that they were challenged. And so it's going to take all of those people who feel like they can't say anything just to occasionally stick their head above the parapet, because one does, and then another does, and then another does, and another does, until movements like this emerge and bills like the Higher Education Bill emerge, and we change the culture.
I think if you remember one thing that Charlie said today, remember that one, poverty of bravery. I think that is true, and it's not just in the higher education sector, of course. One of our speakers this afternoon is Nick Buckley, and I think I've seen him in the audio. In fact, there he is. He's put his hand up. And of course, Nick, back in 2020, rightly warned that Black Lives Matter was a Marxist organisation intent on ridding us of the nuclear family and of the nation state and basically our values. And because, I know, and Nick will say later how many, but there wasn't that many people decided to sign a petition complaining it, and the trustees of the charity that he founded fired him. With the help of the Free Speech Union, the trustees were then either fired or resigned en masse. But you find it with multinational corporations, I think, in particular as well, where they just see about half a dozen people or a dozen people on Twitter having a go at them, and all of a sudden they just change their policies. I mean, it's ridiculous. Margaret Thatcher once famously said that when she left office, she was going to set up a new company called Rent-A-Spine. I really wish that had been possible. I don't really have time for questions from the audience, and I'm very sorry about that, and that's because we're running out of time, and I do apologise. But maybe if you just want to close, maybe you start first, and I'll go to you, Charlie.
What I would say is I think it's very important when we think of cancel culture to understand where woke comes from. This is really, as Matt said, it's about sacralizing, making sacred race, gender, sexual minority groups. Once you have that mindset, anything that might offend the most hypothetically sensitive member of such a group becomes something that's forbidden, and if you transgress that, you're a blasphemer and you must be canceled. And the reality is it's not just the 10% of radical professors, 10 to 20% who support no platforming. It is the 40 to 50% of left liberal professors who sign up to free speech, who support it in the abstract, but have a soft spot for these sacred minorities and a fear that they are morally transgressing if they are not always on the right side of any cause to support these minority groups. And it is that left liberal group in the middle, and I would argue that has never stood up really to claims around identity. And we can go back to the 60s. I'm sorry, you can go in the 60s and 70s, 80s, we had speech codes, political correctness. They have never stood up to, and that's why it's such a powerful weapon. So until we address that sacralization of these groups, we are never going to fix this problem.
Charlie.
I believe we need to start calling out and embarrassing these people who go up on stages and try to prevent people from speaking. They embarrass themselves enough, manifestly we all look at them and think, oh my God. But we need to be clear about what our standards are. In an attempt to be as liberal and as inclusive, and I don't mean inclusive in the woke sense, but truly a free society, we've watered down our own sense of what we define our culture as being. It doesn't mean other cultures shouldn't, in fact they should, state clearly what theirs are, and then those who are undecided can float about and choose where they want to go. But we need to be clear about what our values are, and then manifestly demonstrate them in our attitudes, our behaviours, and then call out those who try to undermine them and make them feel ashamed for doing this.
So thank you very much.